The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and today, my friends, we got a Doug Ford conversation to be had. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, the province within the country of Canada. We are not going to be talking about our glorious leader, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has now officially rewritten the LGBT plus community to the 2S LGBTQAA plus community. No, we're not talking about them. We're not talking about the alphabet community. We are talking about coronavirus. We are talking about vaccines. We are talking about Doug Ford in the province of Ontario. And today, if today in Ontario you are the unclean, the unvaccinated, the scourge of humanity, the people that do not and are carriers of COVID-19, Delta variants, the other strains that are coming out of Japan, that would lead us to the 5th and 6th waves. If you've been following along on our prior episodes, take a listen at droidscanada.com. That's droidscanada.com to go back and listen to all of our past episodes. But we are talking about the vaccines today. So in Ontario, if you are unvaccinated and do want to book yourself a vaccine, by all means, if you're over the age of 60, it is highly recommended, and we at the show here would recommend anyone over the age of 60 to go ahead and get that vaccine, because if you're going to break down numbers, if you're getting into the age of 60 and over, then you know that this flu hits hard and it hits bad. If you look at the mortality rates of the people that are over the age of 70 is when it gets really bad. So, as a precaution, if you're 60 and over, great, go ahead and get that vaccine. If you're under the age of 60, that's going to be a personal choice that you should make. Is this something, and is this a decision that's right for you? Do you have contact with elderly people? If you do, you might want to give some consideration to them. If they don't have the vaccine, maybe yourself should go ahead and get it. We have always been a supporter of vaccines. So if you're looking for any type of anti-vaccine stance and to say that this vaccine has a microchip in it and it's deadly and you're going to die, you will not find it on this program. This program is The Fact Is, and the fact is this vaccine is safe for people to take. Now, if you want your vaccine, you are going to book your vaccine at covid19-19.ontario.ca. You will take a look and you can see here, as of October 1st, 2021, the statement reads, your second dose. My friends, you will receive an mRNA vaccine, in parentheses, either Moderna or Pfizer, end parentheses, at the clinic depending on supplies and age eligibility. If you had Moderna or Pfizer for your first dose, you can safely take either Moderna or Pfizer for your second dose for strong protection against COVID-19. If you had AstraZeneca for your first dose, you can safely take either Moderna, Pfizer, or AstraZeneca for your second dose for strong protection. So we will look. It's offering either Moderna or Pfizer. They do mention AstraZeneca, but you will receive either Moderna or Pfizer. Why is this important? Why are just Moderna and Pfizer important? Because in Ontario, and again, we can use AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson had their own vaccine out. that came out, but they're no longer offered. There's only 2 that are offered. Well, why is that? Well, Doug Ford is taking money from Pfizer and Moderna. He's taking money from lobbyists. There is a strong connection to the Doug Ford government and these 2 organizations. So that's why those 2 organizations have the contract from the provincial government to supply the citizens with those 2 and only 2 companies and the 2 vaccines. So there's 2 individuals responsible for this. And we're going to get into an article here, and this is from canucklaw.ca. This is an article, this is an old article, it's not a large website, and it's an old article from May 17th, 2021. And it's authored by an individual called Ronnie. Ronnie is like Prince and has no last name. Nonetheless, and here's the article. So canucklaw.ca. Another Ford campaigner, now a lobbyist, this time for AstraZeneca Rubicon strategy. Back we go with the pharmaceutical lobbying in Ontario. This time it's AstraZeneca. This is inappropriately using its political influence in order to peddle their drugs. Ever wonder why Ford insists on mandating martial law until everyone is vaccinated? Look who he's been talking to. Now there's 2 names that come up. Is it Patrick Harris and Sarah, I apologize, Letersky. And they're both for AstraZeneca, and they work for the company of Rubicon Strategy, and their client was AstraZeneca. The Ontario Lobbying Registry is open to the public, and I do recommend taking a look at the Ontario Lobbying Registry. Type that into Google, you will pull up that information, and you can type and search till your heart's content of all companies. Anyone can search it, and for any reason. It's particularly useful in determining who politicians have been talking to, on whose behalf, and on what subject matter. It can really be a goldmine if used properly. So Sarah shows her LinkedIn profile, has been an Ontario Board of Member and Vice President of the Rubicon Strategy Inc., and that's from September 20th until current time. Prior to that, she was the Chief of Staff at the Ontario Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Prior to that, she worked as a Director of Communications for the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, and Communications Advisor to the Office of the Leader of the Official Opposition from March 2017 to June of 2018 when she moved into government, the same time that the Ford government was elected to run the provincial government in Ontario. As a war room operative, she helped elect Doug Ford as Premier of Ontario, as Chief of Staff in Premier Ford's government. Sarah built an impressive network of peers and successfully managed communications on a number of contentious files. If you need something at Queen's Park, Sarah knows who to talk to and how to get it done. Meet Sarah Letersky. She helped get Doug Ford elected into office in 2018 and became his Chief of Staff. Now she works with Rubicon Strategy. One of her clients is AstraZeneca, who wants to sell their products in Ontario. We have seen this pattern before with Pfizer and Emergent Biosolutions. It's also been happening in British Columbia and Nova Scotia. Patrick Harris is the individual to look at as well. So the other lobbyists, Patrick Harris, spent time working for federal politicians, which is interesting, given the crossover between Ontario and Ottawa. He likely has plenty of connections, and the rabbit hole goes deeper. Jan O'Driscoll worked for Stephen Harper, then was a Chief of Staff for Ford, contributed to his 2018 election. Corey Tenachi was Communications Director for Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, and helped Ford get elected. Another honorable mention at Rubicon Strategy is Christine Simonson. She also claims credit for helping to make Doug Ford premier. In June 2018, she claims to have gotten 17 candidates elected to Parliament. One of the excerpts here: with years of experience leading tactical communications and tough policy files, Jan is a straight shooter that gets the job done. He held senior leadership roles in private sectors as well as with several federal cabinet ministers in Harper's government. Most recently, Jan served as chief of staff in several key ministries in Premier Ford's government, where he drove transformational initiatives to get wins for the people of Ontario. With 2 decades in public affairs, Corey has served as Director of Communications to the Prime Minister of Canada, managed the cable news channel Sun News, and served as Executive Director for the Renewable Fuels Association. Corey was the manager of the 2018 campaign that saw Doug Ford become Premier of Ontario, and is now on leave of absence to manage the 2022 campaign for the Ontario PC Party, who's also a lobbyist for Rubicon, also a lobbyist for pharmaceutical companies. But it's good to see that he's going to be back on the campaign trail for the 2022 re-election campaign for Doug Ford. Christine's experience in legal profession, coupled with her experience in marketing and promotion, gives her an edge when it comes to grassroots activism. Before joining Rubicon, Christine was active in the Ontario PC Party War Room during the 2008 provincial election. Christine's guidance elected 17 of the PC, the Conservative MPPs, for Peel Region, Halton, Toronto, and Northern Ontario. Christine was the PC party organizer for Peel Region and played a senior role in organizing the PC leadership race of 2018. Throwback to one of our earlier shows when we highlighted how one of the member of provincial parliament spent and sent back to the government to be reimbursed for the few dollars that she spent at Dollarama. Take a listen at droidscanada.com for that. Interesting. Going back to Rubicon's website, and another individual, Fadi, has invested a decade in politics. He's worked across all 3 levels of government. He's served as senior advisor to the interim leader of the Ontario Liberal Party and has significant experience in public and stakeholder relationships. He's won campaigns and delivered results for premiers and top-level public policy leaders. Fadi doesn't stop till the job is done, and done well. Back to the article. Of course, if Ford hadn't been elected in 2018, Fadi El-Masri may have been sent instead. He's got plenty of ties to the Ontario Liberal Party and would have used that to lobby. Also, being a mouthpiece for political candidates doesn't stop with Ontario. 2 other Rubicon employees, Emphreys Grady and Cole Hogan, also claim to have been involved in making Jason Kenney the Premier of Alberta. It has to be asked, does being a handler for a political candidate stop once that person is elected? Or are there favors that need to be paid back? In all honesty, it appears that all politicians are just actors being spoon-fed a script by interested parties. If you didn't have enough reason not to trust the Canadian news, consider that Don Newman, who claimed to be a journalist, is the executive vice president of Rubicon. Did you ever hear anyone call out this sort of thing when he gave his nightly news broadcast? In fairness, lobbying or public relations is just a part of what the group does. They are also involved in the defense industry. However, that will be for another article. Now it goes on to list all these particular individuals and the companies that they work for. Getting back to the Doug Ford government, with yet more and more people that are lobbying or being had jobs in the government, being paid off, working for big pharmaceutical companies and pushing vaccines for all. We know now today in Israel, and Israel is going to be the benchmark of the fastest country to get all citizens vaccinated, highest vaccine rates in the quickest amount of times. And we know for a fact they're working on their third and fourth booster shots. And we know because of the work that Israeli doctors are doing, we know that these vaccines degrade. They're not meant for protection such as polio or tetanus. They're not meant. They have a shelf life in the body, and we know that it's around 7 months and it starts to degrade. So the question you have to ask yourself is that with all these political connections in place, and we have large pharmaceutical companies that are paying individuals to speak to government to lobby on their behalf, we'll see more procedures and policies in place to buy more and more vaccines and ensure that more and more people are vaccinated and keep on getting vaccinated. And currently, we can look at what these doctors have said. And we can go back to the chief medical officer in Ontario. And when they were talking about we need to get to a vaccine percentage at 75%, and we'll start opening up the economy. But we know that this isn't true. We know that it's their stages, the color-coded stages that they went to. Then they changed it to another form of opening up the charts. And if we get to X amount of people vaccinated, then we'll make sure that we open up more and more. But this isn't the case. It's been further restrictions. Now we're at the point, if you're not vaccinated, you cannot enter. You cannot be a part of this. You cannot be in a gym. You cannot go to a movie. You cannot go to a restaurant. You cannot participate. Meanwhile, vaccine rates continue to go higher and higher and higher. There's the percentage, more and more people are getting vaccinated, but yet, as it turns out, as more and more people are vaccinated, these other plans that they implemented, these government bureaucrats, have not eased in restrictions. And this is happening the world over. This is happening in Australia. This is happening in Scotland. This is happening in Wales, where we know in Scotland, an interesting article came out just the other day, taken from heraldscotland.com. So many key decisions affecting life in Scotland are now made without even a debate, never mind a vote, in the Scottish Parliament, that Holyrood risks being sidelined to the point of irrelevance. The discussion has begun to allow COVID emergency mandates to be never-ending, to always give that emergency power for the government, and under the guise of it's here to help the people. Now, using Nazis and using Nazi Germany to make a point and calling people Nazis, we've covered this from our first episodes, accusing others of what you're actually doing. And we don't like to use references of, well, the Nazis did this, so it must be bad, and taking the Nazis at the easily the worst government in the world ever. And I'm not using or taking World War II German government and saying this is a beacon, to something to look to. I will point out that when Adolf Hitler was elected chancellor back in the 30s, he pinned, and in part of his movement was to create a problem, and his problem was the communist. And he blamed the communists for a lot of things. And it was very fractured. It was either right or left politics, much like today. There was no middle ground. It's becoming very polarized, much like today. And what Adolf Hitler and his team pointed out was that it was, again, all of Germany's problems was because of communists, and we have to stop the communists. Yes, there was the Jewish population in there too. It was lumped in, but it became the communists. So when the Reichstag, which is the parliament buildings, burned to the ground, who did Hitler blame for the burning? We'll read right from the encyclopedia on the Holocaust. The Reichstag fire on February 27th, 1933, the German parliament, the Reichstag, building burned down. The Nazi leadership and its coalition partners used the fire to claim that communists were planning a violent uprising. They claimed that emergency legislation was needed to prevent this. The ruling act, commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, abolished a number of constitutional protections and paved the way for Nazi dictatorship. I am no way comparing government today of the Nazis, but what I am comparing this to is the communists is the virus, and the emergency legislation to protect us from the virus is not going away. Hitler went on to rule under emergency powers for the next 12 years, and only after the next 12 years did his emergency powers end, is when he was found dead in a bunker. And the end of the war happened. But he didn't take power by being elected. He took power through emergency legislation. And this is the point where we are at today. It has been 2 weeks to crush the curve, and we are approaching our 2-year anniversary. And yet, the world over, not one government has retracted their emergency powers, with the exception of the rogue states of Texas and Florida and Missouri and South Dakota. But the federal government in America still is using emergency orders in every province in Canada and in the Commonwealth, and throughout the world is still using emergency orders. So when will they give them up, and how long will this last? Because if we're using the benchmark of the last time this happened in 1933, it's not going to end well. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant. You have yourself a great week, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.
Dan, what happens every Thursday?
That would be DCR Droids Canada Radio.
And what time is it at on Thursday?
That's from 9 till 11 p.m.
Dumb question. Where do you find it?
You find that at accessradio.ca.
And what's the best part?
It's free.